Hello, welcome to Jewish Museum Milwaukee. We are delighted to have you with us tonight, and I am so excited to see this incredible roster of people who keep coming in. I saw that we had a visitor from Chicago, and I saw somebody who was coming in from Baltimore, so feel free to throw in if you're coming from further afield. Where are you visiting us from virtually this evening? My name is Ellie Gettinger, and I am excited as a Hamilton file, both the musical and the historical figure, to be able to go into a little bit more depth with Andrew Porwancher tonight. So we are going to be exploring his book, The Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton. If you have any technical challenges, I know you guys are all pros at this point during the presentation, please use the chat feature to let us know if something's going on, and we'll help you. We'll assist you. Your microphones will remain muted, but you can submit questions through chat as well, or just let us know what you're thinking. We're going to be pulling questions from chat during the Q&A. Many of you, I'm sure, have already donated to support this program and JMM, but if you have not, your donations make programs like this possible. We ask that you please donate to the museum, and we can continue to do great programming like this. So back in September, I think I saw an article about this book. And it was right before Hamilton came to Milwaukee. And actually, if you guys quickly, is there anybody in here who hasn't seen the musical yet? I know Annalisa is here, and she was probably the first person I know who was obsessed with it. But it was one of these things that I remember when I was reading the biography by Chernow, that there's this little bit of a hinting on his Jewish roots, and there's some questionable things. And I was so excited to have found somebody to go in depth here, because I think in the past couple of years, Hamilton has gone from being kind of this kind of afterthought $10 founding father to being really central to the questions of what our nation state was founded on, and how we perceive ourselves to be a country. So we are excited to be able to explore those Jewish connections tonight. And I'm going to introduce our speaker, Andrew Porwancher, a native of Princeton, New Jersey. He earned his degree from Brown and Northwestern before completing a PhD in history at Cambridge. He currently serves as the Wick Carey Associate Professor at the University of Oklahoma and the Ernest May Fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center. In 2017, he won the Longmire Prize for Innovative Teaching. The Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton was just named a finalist for the Journal of American Revolution Book of the Year, and he is now working on his fourth book, Theodore Roosevelt and the Jews. So we'll have to see where that takes him. So without further ado, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Ellie and Cassie and anyone else who was involved in putting this together today. And thank you to all of you at home for tuning in. It's always great to be able to share this story with audiences anywhere. I'm particularly pleased to do it with the Jewish Museum Milwaukee. I actually have family ties to Milwaukee. My parents, who have been married for 43 years, spent their first year of marriage in Milwaukee. My sister, Kara, was born in Milwaukee. My mother went to Marquette. And so we have a really rich history in Milwaukee, and it's a pleasure to be able to do something for the Jewish community there. And for those of you from outside of Milwaukee, welcome as well. So let's get started. Alexander Hamilton was a wanderer in search of promised land. When he left his home in the Caribbean at the age of 18 and set sail for America, Hamilton fixed his eyes on a new Jerusalem. After the courts denied him his inheritance following his mother's premature death, they denied him his birthright. He had to rely on his keen financial and linguistic skills to survive. His is a story of dispossession, a story of exodus, a story of the search for a homeland. His story is the story of the Jewish people. But Hamilton wasn't merely similar to Jewish immigrants. I believe that Alexander Hamilton was himself a Jewish immigrant. And uncovering the truth about his origins is not just a matter of historical curiosity. It provides the key to unlocking why, in his adulthood, Hamilton emerges as a champion of American Jewry against the forces of anti-Semitism. Any case regarding Jewish identity begins, of course, with a mother. And we know that Hamilton's mother, Rachel, was not born a Jew. And so to make my case today, I'd have to demonstrate the likelihood that his mother, Rachel, converts to Judaism prior to Alexander's birth. My case for her conversion begins in 1745 on a sun-kissed island in the Caribbean called St. Croix. Today, St. Croix is part of the US Virgin Islands, but it was at that time a Danish colony. And it's there that Rachel meets and marries Johann Michael Levine. It is my thesis today that the balance of evidence suggests that Johann was Jewish, that Rachel converts to Judaism to marry him, and that although she bears Alexander out of wedlock to a non-Jew, still, she chooses to raise him in her adopted faith of Judaism. So let us begin with Johann Levine. Many Hamilton scholars insist that Johann Levine was not Jewish because, supposedly, he's not identified in the Danish land records or census registers as a Jew. The problem is these scholars didn't bother consulting the original source material from the Danish Caribbean. I learned enough Danish to read through these records. And that was the easy part. The hard part is that they're written in this really crazy 18th century Gothic script that even modern day Danish speakers struggle to decode. But all of these efforts were worth it. What did I find? Well, it turns out these scholars were right. Johann Levine is not identified as a Jew in these records. And that would be problematic for my thesis today, had I not also discovered that every other known Jew on the island is also not identified as Jewish in those same records. What else do we know about Johann Levine? But we know his name was Johann Levine. His name appears under a variety of spellings, which was common at the time, including Levin and Lewin, which is how Jews of Levitic descent spelled their surname in the 18th century, letter for letter. We know he was disproportionately likely to conduct business with Jews, that he had worked as a merchant on another Caribbean island that was known for having a sizable Jewish community. And Hamilton's own grandson explicitly identified Levine as a, quote, rich Danish Jew. So if Levine were in all probability Jewish, might Rachel have converted to Judaism to marry him? Well, consider this. Rachel bears Johann a son, Peter Levine, a year after their marriage, and they do not have this son infant baptized, which was standard practice for island Christians. Years later, Peter Levine, as an adult, undertakes an adult baptism to join the Anglican Church. Well, Anglicans practice infant baptism. Why would Anglicans baptize an adult? There's a few possible reasons why any given adult might be baptized into the Anglican Church. One is if they grew up Christian, but in a sect that only practices adult baptism, that doesn't practice infant baptism. They simply hadn't had their adult baptism yet. And so when they join the Anglicans, they still need to be baptized for the first time. Could this possibility apply to Peter Levine? No. There were no Christian denominations on St. Croix in the years of his upbringing that practiced adult baptism. They exclusively practiced infant baptism. Still, another possibility why Anglicans might baptize an adult is if the person in question had grown up Christian, had been baptized as an infant, but not in the name of the Trinity. there are some Christian sects that are non-Trinitarian. So could it be that Johann Levine grows up in a non-Trinitarian sect, is baptized, but not in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit? The Anglicans then don't recognize that infant baptism, and that explains why he needs an adult baptism. Again, the answer is no. There were no Christian denominations on St. Croix in those years that were non-Trinitarian. The third and final reason why Anglicans might baptize an adult, the only one that plausibly pertains to Peter Levine, is if he was converting to Christianity. Hamilton scholars have long been fixed on the assumption that Rachel and Johann and their son Peter were all cradle to grave Christians. And so they are baffled by Peter's otherwise inexplicable adult baptism. But if Johann was Jewish and Rachel converts to Judaism to marry him, then that would make Peter a Jew, and his need for an adult baptism, this long-standing mystery among Hamilton scholars, is suddenly easily explained. But that is just one piece of evidence for you to consider. Rachel and Johann have a deeply troubled marriage. He has her imprisoned for infidelity. And when she gets out of prison, she absconds from this Danish island of St. Croix, and she winds up on the British Caribbean island of Nevis. And it is there that Rachel bears Alexander out of wedlock to a Scottish colonist named James Hamilton. Now, James Hamilton unquestionably was a Gentile. However, there are compelling reasons to think that Rachel raises Alexander in her adopted faith of Judaism. For one, there is no baptismal record for Alexander Hamilton on the island. Now, those records are incomplete, but the ones we have show no entry for Alexander. If he was Jewish, we would expect that he was circumcised. However, there are no surviving circumcision records for any Jews that were living on Nevis. We do, however, have an even more compelling piece of evidence than the absence of a baptismal record, which is the fact that Rachel enrolls Alexander in a Jewish school where he begins rudimentary study of the Torah in the original Hebrew. When he was little, his teacher would put him on a table, presumably so they would be eye level, and he would recite the 10 Commandments to her in the original Hebrew. Now, Hamilton scholars have long known that there's no baptismal record. They've long known that he went to this Jewish school. How have they made sense of these curiosities? They say, well, he was born out of wedlock, and so he must have been denied an infant baptism on account of his illegitimacy. And if he can't be baptized into the church, he can't go to the church school, and that must be why he goes to the Jewish school. This is a very neat and tidy explanation, and it's one that would be problematic for my thesis had I not gone down to Nevis and gone through those church records and found that on that island, and indeed throughout the Caribbean, children born out of wedlock were indeed baptized into the church. We have precious little grounds for assuming that Hamilton's illegitimacy posed any obstacle towards his church membership or goes any way towards explaining his enrollment at a Jewish school. Moreover, these Hamilton scholars make a critical error in assuming that a child who was Christian would have attended a Jewish school in that time and place. Jewish schools were, of course, religious instruments. They existed to turn Jewish children into observant Jewish adults, to cultivate in these children a strong sense of Jewish identity, to instill in them a shared sense of Jewish peoplehood with their co-religionists spread out across the diaspora. So it would be remarkable indeed to find a child who was considered Christian at that time attending a school like that. This is not the 21st century. This is the 18th. And the boundaries would be far more rigid. In fact, there is not a single recorded instance that any historian I know of has ever come across from that time period of a child who was considered Christian attending a Jewish school. Moreover, Hamilton scholars misunderstand the nature of Jewish-Christian relations in the Caribbean at that time, when they assume that a Jewish school would have taken in a child who was considered Christian. And I want to take a few minutes to unpack the fraught nature of the Jewish experience on the island, because it is central to the book. In the 18th century, the Caribbean was the center of Jewish life in the Western Hemisphere. There were more Jews living on a single Dutch island in the West Indies than on the entire continent of North America. Some islands, 40% of the free population was Jewish. On Nevis, where Hamilton grows up, it's fully 25% Jewish, right? As I like to joke with my grandma, these may not be Boca Raton numbers, but they're respectable. Why are there so many Jews on these islands? One word: sugar. The tropical heat and rich soil of the Caribbean made these islands ideal for cultivating sugar, the ultimate cash crop of the 18th century. So lucrative was the Caribbean sugar trade that Britain, for instance, generated more riches from its tiny collection of Caribbean islands than from all of its North American colonies combined. The French, in treaty negotiations, had to choose between giving up one small sugar-producing island in the Caribbean or all of Canada. And they gave up all of Canada. Now, Jews were particularly well positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that the Caribbean sugar trade presented. Jews were skilled in commerce. They were fluent in multiple languages. They were embedded in trade networks with fellow Jews on both sides of the Atlantic. Those European powers willing to tolerate some kind of Jewish presence on their Caribbean colonies stood to profit for that tolerance. And so religious diversity, to the extent that we see it in places like Nevis, is not celebrated by the British. It is begrudgingly accepted in the name of cash crop cultivation. The status of Jews there is always precarious, especially as islands reach peak sugar productivity and the need for further immigration wanes. The configuration of Jewish life in Charlestown, the main port town on Nevis, where Hamilton lives, that geography underscores how Jews occupy a separate and subordinate rung on the island hierarchy. Jews are not dispersed evenly throughout Charlestown. They are concentrated in a Jewish quarter. And this Jewish quarter is not the most prized real estate on the island. It's sandwiched between a jail on one side and a mosquito-infested backwater called the Bogs on the other. And this setup is telling. Jews in Europe had long dwelled in their own less desirable districts. In other words, Jews and Christians aren't coming to Nevis and creating a whole new set of spatial and social relationships between the two faith groups. They are recreating patterns they already know from the old world. Patterns designed to ensure a degree of segregation, cultural, religious, and geographic, between Jewish and Christian life. The site of the parish church on Nevis underscores how this premium on religious segregation migrated with the colonists to the New World. Now, in many places in Europe, there were regulations requiring maximal distance between churches and synagogues. On Nevis, there was no such requirement, and yet they chose to adhere to this convention anyway, building the church and the parish as far from the synagogue as possible, underscoring the staying power of these norms that prized a division between Jews and Christians. Why have I taken such pains to reconstruct the fraught tenor of the Jewish experience on Nevis? Because it strains believability to think that amid this dicey political climate, the Jews of Nevis would have educated Alexander Hamilton unless they considered him one of their own. The politics were too treacherous. The stakes were too high. The Jewish continued residence on Nevis too doubtful for the Jewish community to have otherwise hazarded such an unprecedented risk. Hamilton and his mother stay on the island of Nevis until about his 11th birthday, and they relocate to St. Croix, the Danish Caribbean island. And there, Rachel runs a store out of the first floor of a building, and they live on the second story. And this arrangement continues for a couple years. In February of 1768, things take a turn for the worse. Both mother and son fall deathly ill. They suffer together in a single bed. Alexander pulls back from the brink, but Rachel, on February 19th, 1768, takes her final breath. And the details surrounding Rachel's passing and burial may be instructive for our purposes today. For one, Rachel maintained her surname Levine until her dying day. She had not seen Johann in 18 years, and yet she keeps this surname belonging to her Jewish husband, hinting at an abiding connection to her own Jewish identity. What's more, Rachel was not buried in the church cemetery. Now, burial in a Jewish cemetery wasn't an option for anyone on St. Croix. St. Croix didn't have the large Jewish communities like other Caribbean islands had. They had a few scattered Jews. If you were Jewish, your only real option was to be buried at the home of a relative. And in fact, Rachel is buried at her sister's estate. Now, interestingly, Rachel's death was recorded in a church register. Hamilton scholars have interpreted that, seemingly reasonably, to mean that she must have been a member of that church. But what these scholars don't realize is that states don't start keeping records of deaths, civil records, until the 19th century. In the 18th century, they are relying on church records to serve as de facto state records. And so it was not uncommon for Jewish deaths to be recorded in church registers, especially in places where there were too few Jews to have a synagogue with its own death records that they could turn over to the state. A number of Hamilton scholars note that Rachel's funeral was presided over by a Christian clergyman. And this too would be problematic for my thesis, except there's not a shred of evidence for it. Every Hamilton scholar who makes this claim just cites another Hamilton scholar who makes this claim. It is wholly circular, and yet one more instance of the mythology of fictions that continues to shroud our understanding of Hamilton's early years. So if Alexander Hamilton did in all likelihood have a Jewish identity in his upbringing, when does he start identifying as Christian? Well, I suspect that any Jewish identity Hamilton may have had, he abandons with his mother's death. He's no longer on Nevis, home to the sizable Jewish community that had educated him. His mother has passed away. Whatever familial and communal ties to Judaism he might have had are severed. There is newly uncovered evidence from the Caribbean, which I talk about in the book, from Hamilton's teenage years that underscores my theory that one, he's not identifying as a Jew in his teenage years, but two, he was a latecomer to the Christian faith. After his mother's death at the age of 13, and before he leaves the Caribbean at the age of 18, Hamilton is living as an orphan in St. Croix. And during these years, when he's 17 years old, he is called to give testimony in a court case. And he's brought up to the witness stand, and he is assessed by a lawyer for his competency to give sworn testimony. And he's asked how he identifies, and he says that he's Anglican. And then he's asked, well, then you've taken communion. And Hamilton admits that no, he's never taken communion, which is quite an oddity if someone had actually been born and raised Anglican. The judge forbids Hamilton from giving sworn testimony on the basis of Hamilton's insufficient bona fides as a Christian. There's one other sidelight from Hamilton's Caribbean years that I want to mention. When his mother dies, he's working for an import-export company. He works as a clerk through the rest of his teenage years until he leaves for America. And it is through that experience that Hamilton is honing all of the skills that would uniquely situate him to become the visionary of America's financial future. If you think about other founders, people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they grew up on plantations. They're versed in a feudal form of economy. Hamilton is getting exposed to lessons in real time in credit, finance, debt, currency, maritime trade. He is honing all of the skills that he would later bring to bear as the nation's visionary first Treasury Secretary. And given the prominence of Jewish traders in the Caribbean, it is all but certain that Hamilton came into contact with the kinds of Jewish merchants with whom he'd later collaborate with in building up the financial sector in New York City. This arrangement continues until August 1772, when a catastrophic hurricane brutalizes the Eastern Caribbean. The eye of the storm passes directly over Hamilton's island. Amid the twin forces of gale force winds and 70-foot waves, ships from the harbor are flung inland, homes reduced to rubble, and the lives of hundreds of islanders summarily extinguished. The best surviving description we have of the storm comes from the pen of none other than an 18-year-old Alexander Hamilton. And islanders are so taken by his precocious facility with language when he publishes a description of the storm in the island paper that they collect money to fund his college education in America. And Hamilton ultimately winds up in New York City, where he enrolls at what was then called King's College, what gets renamed after the Revolution, Columbia, as it's still known today, of course. When Hamilton gets to New York, he does something really interesting. He lies about his past. Every piece of evidence we have from the Caribbean, including Hamilton's own testimony in the court case I just mentioned, places his year of birth in 1754. But he gets to New York and he claims he's born in 1757. Why would Hamilton lie about his age? Well, the average incoming freshman at King's College at that time is only 15. Hamilton, as a Caribbean outsider, as an orphan eager to fit in, it'd be unsurprising if he fudged his age to seem like the same age as other new students. The fact that Hamilton is diminutive in stature and boyish in face would have made the deception all the easier to carry out. But when Hamilton starts his life in America lying about his age, he then has to maintain this lie for consistency's sake for the rest of his life. There are two lessons for us to glean from this anecdote for our purposes. First, it tells us that Hamilton was willing to conceal some foundational aspect of his Caribbean past, like his year of birth. And even more importantly, he was able to get away with it for the rest of his life without any Caribbean contemporary ever exposing his falsehood, making it that much more plausible that Hamilton could have obscured a Jewish heritage with comparable success. Let's take a step back and talk about what all of this adds up to. I know there are people in corners of academia who will tell you, Porwancher, he's unhinged. He's gone rogue this time. He's a caricature from New Jersey, trafficking in Jewish delusion. Well, I take comfort in the words of another great American statesman, John Adams, who once famously said, "Facts are stubborn things." Let's take an inventory of some relevant facts. Johann Levine had a Jewish surname, a Jewish profession, conducted business with Jews, came from an island with a Jewish community, is identified by Hamilton's own grandson as a Jew. Rachel, then after marrying him, they have a son, Peter, who's not infant baptized, who gets an adult baptism under circumstances that only make sense if he's converting to Christianity. She then has this other son, Alexander, for whom we also have no baptismal record, and whom she enrolls in a Jewish school, where we know he begins rudimentary study of the Torah in Hebrew, and this at a time when Jewish schools exclusively educated Jewish children. She keeps her surname from her ex-husband until her dying day. She's not buried in the church cemetery. Hamilton, later as a teenager, is forbidden from giving sworn testimony because despite claiming to be Anglican, he's never taken communion. And in fact, even on his deathbed, when he's laid down, he had still never taken communion. And then when Hamilton gets to New York, we find that he is both willing and able to obscure foundational elements of his West Indian upbringing. If we insist on adhering to the unfounded article of faith that these people were all cradled to grave Christians, these are really inconvenient facts. Hamilton biographers have glossed over these facts or used words such as shocking, mysterious, and inexplicable to describe them. As my mother likes to say when things don't quite add up, that dog don't hunt. And I don't know where she got that expression. She is a Jew from Montreal. I don't think she's ever been south of Philadelphia, but she does say it. I realize the notion that an American founder harbored a secret Jewish identity sounds on its face a little outlandish. But my book proceeds from the foundational premise of all research, which is that the best argument is the one that accounts for the most evidence. Now, I know we have a really bright audience in Milwaukee. I know that my mother's a Marquette alum. I know that there's an intellectual rigor I can expect from this crowd. And maybe people out there have cultivated such a healthy sense of skepticism that you're thinking, you know what, Porwancher, if this were true, if this were somehow possibly true, we'd already know. How could a secret this significant about a historical figure this iconic remain hidden for this long? It's actually not that surprising for a lot of reasons. For one, Hamilton maintained a lifelong silence about his Caribbean origins. For a statesman whose acceptance into the upper echelons of American civic life required at least a nominal pretense to a Christian identity, remaining taciturn about any Jewish roots would have been prudent, to say the least. Hamilton scholars have largely followed the lead of their subject in glossing over his early years. Their primary interests are the extraordinary events of Hamilton's American adulthood. The task of studying his upbringing is not just a peripheral, but relatively recent endeavor. Even a foundational fact about his childhood, like his mother's name, remained unknown to scholars until the 20th century. It should come as little surprise then that Hamilton's religious upbringing is an underdeveloped field of study. Moreover, if you want to write about Hamilton's adulthood, as most biographers do, you have all of the sources from his American years collected in 27 volumes, the papers of Alexander Hamilton, available at most any university library. You could write a perfectly good, capacious biography just focusing on Hamilton's American life without ever leaving the UW-Milwaukee library. But if you want to write about Hamilton's Caribbean origins, you've got to track down obscure sources in far-flung Caribbean islands and the European capitals of the countries that colonized those islands. And you're dealing with documents in not just Danish, but also French, Portuguese, German, the list goes on. The painstaking task of recovering the esoteric details of Hamilton's youth is hardly worth the onerous effort for the typical Hamilton biographer whose native tongue is English and whose principal concerns lie with topics like the Revolution or the Constitutional Convention. And so in this way, vital facts about even a renowned historical icon can remain submerged for centuries. The notion that we may have missed something major about an American founder shouldn't strike us as terribly remote. Consider, by way of analogy, Thomas Jefferson. For 200 years, rumors that he had fathered children with Sally Hemings were lent little credence in academic circles until just in the last generation, a pioneering scholar, Annette Gordon Reed, undertook new research, and her findings combined with DNA testing has led to a new consensus among scholars that Jefferson almost certainly did father children with Sally Hemings. And I'm very pleased for those of you who've gotten the book that Annette Gordon Reed kindly blurbed the book on the back cover. So that was a coup for me if you're in the early American history world. The idea that we may have missed something major about a founding father at this point should start to strike us as increasingly commonplace. When Hamilton gets to America, he doesn't identify as Jewish. To our knowledge, he doesn't breathe a word about a Jewish heritage, and yet he never forgets. No other American founder would do more to make the promise of equality real for America's Jews. And I think we're going to go to questions around 8:45 or 7:45 your time. So I'm going to condense the last 2/3 of the book into about 7 minutes here. I'll try to think what the best vignettes are. Well, Hamilton's advocacy for American Jewry assumes a variety of forms. He is, of course, best remembered as the financial visionary who sets into motion the modern financial system during George Washington's administration. It was hugely controversial, and Hamilton's opponents routinely infused their invective against him in their bid to derail his legislative agenda. They infused it with anti-Semitism. They routinely accused Hamilton of pursuing his particular plans merely to enrich greedy Jews. There was a belief at that time that a secret cabal of globalist Jewish bankers pulled the strings of international finance. I don't know if you could imagine anyone saying that about us today, but commonplace in the 1790s as it is. Perhaps no other self-professing Christian encountered more anti-Semitism than did Alexander Hamilton because of his work in the financial sector, because he was in alliance with Jews working in commerce and in trade and in banking. Hamilton is also an influential alumnus of Columbia, and he institutes a number of Jewish-friendly reforms. He puts the first Jew on the board of an American college. There had been higher education since the founding of Harvard in the 1630s, and yet never before had a Jew sat on the board of an American college. And there wouldn't be another Jew on the board of Columbia until the 20th century. Hamilton's 150 years ahead of his time. And by the way, the second Jew to sit on the board of Columbia is a name that some of you, especially the lawyers in the audience, will recognize, Benjamin Cardozo, who is most famous for being the second Jew on the US Supreme Court. Also the second Jew on the Columbia board. He's always the second Jew to do something. He's the ultimate Jewish silver medalist. Then Hamilton also is instrumental in doing away with mandatory forms of Christian worship for undergrads at Columbia, even though all of the students are Christian. Hamilton also changes the rules of eligibility for the college presidency so that Jews are eligible to be president of Columbia. If you look at other colonial era colleges like Rutgers or Brown, where I went to grad school, they don't make those kinds of reforms until the 20th century. Again, Hamilton is 150 years ahead of his time. Hamilton is also one of the most important advocates in the courts in his career as a lawyer for American Jews. And in fact, it is the courtroom that provides the forum where Hamilton issues one of the most emphatic denunciations of anti-Semitism to pass the lips of any American founder. Hamilton's Jewish witnesses are impugned purely on the basis of their Jewish identities. And Hamilton, in a stirring closing argument, perhaps the most well-regarded by his contemporaries of his career, he asked the court, pointing to the opposing counsel, has he forgotten what this race once were? When under the immediate government of God himself, they were selected as the witnesses of his miracles and charged with the spirit of prophecy, were not the witnesses of that pure and holy, happy and heaven-approved faith? It is all too easy for us in 2022 to overlook just how extraordinary these remarks were. Jews had been the contempt of Europe for centuries, and here was a giant of American political life demanding that in an American courtroom, a Jew and a Gentile stand equal before the law. And by the way, Hamilton ends up winning that case. Let me say in closing a few words about what I see as the striking parallels between the history of the Jewish people and Hamilton's own. Jewish tradition teaches that the Jews were robbed of their land by the Romans. Amid the resulting diaspora, the Jews are outsiders in other lands. In societies where power was rooted in land, Jews could not own land. Jews had to become cultural intermediaries, tradesmen between societies. They had to cultivate linguistic and financial acumen by virtue of their marginality. And for those Jews who made it to America in the early years of the Republic, they had faith that this new Republic could be their new Jerusalem. So it was with Alexander Hamilton. He too knew what it meant to live on the margins. He too learned commerce and languages in order to survive. He too came to America searching for his redemptive homeland. Hamilton once wrote of the Jewish people that their progress is entirely out of the ordinary course of human events. I'm quoting here. Is it not then a fair conclusion that the cause is an extraordinary one, that it is the effect of some great providential plan? Perhaps Hamilton saw some divine intervention in his own unlikely rise from Caribbean obscurity to American founder. It was precisely because Hamilton and his Jewish allies were outsiders that they were able to become consummate modernizers. In a world that was largely rural, they flocked to urban life. In a world that was predominantly agrarian, they were drawn to trade and finance. In a world where loyalties often lay with your local state first and the country at large second, Hamilton and his Jewish compatriots believed in the promise of a unified American nation. It has been said that if you want to see a monument to Thomas Jefferson, you can go down to the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and there you will find carved from white marble a beautiful memorial honoring the author of the Declaration of Independence. But if you want to see a monument to Hamilton, look all around you every day. We are living in the urban, commercial, cosmopolitan, multilingual future that he envisioned. What Hamilton understood was that the American future belonged not to the children of plantation aristocrats, it belonged to the city dwellers, to the immigrants, to the outsiders, to the entrepreneurs. It belonged to people like him. It belonged to people like his Jewish allies. If the Jewish people were not yet fully accepted in the America of Hamilton's day, they surely could be in the America of Hamilton's dream. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Andrew. Thank you so much. I can already see there are questions that are popping up. And this was the question that just got in there. Jane Avner is asking, how did you get interested in this topic? And I actually would love if you could frame this with, most of us became much more engaged in Hamilton trivia in the last 5 years with the musical. How do you kind of correspond with Hamiltonia, as it were, in the kind of broader pop cultural landscape?
Sure. So I was hired to teach constitutional history at the University of Oklahoma, and I love to bring in biographical details about the iconic figures whom we study. My hope is that if I can make a historical figure seem more human, that can make something like the Federalist Papers seem less of a bloodless abstraction and more of a flesh and blood artifact of humanity. And Hamilton was such an interesting figure to read about, to share details with my students for so many reasons that we've all become familiar with. But what was so striking to me is that he had a mother named Rachel Levine who sent him to Hebrew school, and no scholar really had anything else to say about that. And so it always nagged me. And I had actually first floated an idea for a book like this to an editor back in 2013. And it wasn't really until late 14, early 15 that I was able to have the time freed up, because I've been working on a couple other books, to actually get a grant to go down to the Caribbean and start to do research on my own. And this took me down this rabbit hole that lasted the better part of a decade, and it has culminated in the publication of this book. And with respect to the musical, I happen to be in New York City doing research for the book because Hamilton's legal papers are housed in New York City at his alma mater. And I was living about 2 blocks away from the theater venue, from the Rogers Theater, where the musical at that point was in previews. It hadn't had its premiere yet. And I thought, well, I should go see this because it sounds so gimmicky. This is probably going to shut down in 2 weeks. And this is going to be my only chance to see Hamilton. And so I was able to get a face value ticket to one of these preview shows before it premiered. And I was blown away. And it turns out everybody else was as well. And so, as I said to you earlier, I'm hugely indebted to Lin-Manuel for creating just extraordinary public interest in a historical figure who in many ways is the forgotten founder until 2015.
So we have a lot of questions that are kind of in the universe of genealogy and descent. So one of those, and I'm going to kind of lump them into a bigger chunk, sure, is what did you find in terms of, because there's certainly in those same kind of suspicious or shocking moments are revelations of potential African heritage as well. And if you found anything, that's one of those things that sneaks through in kind of some of the subplots of things. And then the other question is a question of James Hamilton is his biological father or his stepfather. Is that a debate, or is James Hamilton, what is James Hamilton's role in Hamilton's life?
Sure. So as far as African ancestry goes, there's no historical evidence that I've ever seen to that effect. There are people who have made this claim. To my knowledge, there's no evidence for it. As far as the latter question about James Hamilton, it is assumed, was Alexander Hamilton's father, but even that we don't really know for sure, because Hamilton, after his mother's death, ends up getting taken in by this merchant, and this merchant named Thomas Stevens has a son on St. Croix who looks just like Alexander. And from Hamilton's day to our own, people have speculated that the reason this merchant randomly takes in this orphan is because he was actually the father, and that would explain why Hamilton and this fellow Ned Stevens looked like they were brothers. So one of the things that you realize when you start studying the 18th century Caribbean is that there are more questions than answers, that we're dealing with a fragmentary record, and that most anything you could say about Hamilton's early years, putting aside his religious identity, most anything you could say is a question of probability rather than certainty. And the case for his Jewish identity is of a piece with the broader limitations that we face when writing about Hamilton's Caribbean years.
In thinking about this, as we'll keep on this genealogy thing, what happened to his half brother? Did he stay on Nevis? Did he go back to? Did Hamilton have a relationship with this person?
So he ends up moving to South Carolina, and his half brother did not go with Rachel to Nevis. So when Rachel abandons her husband Johann, she also abandons her son, and who at the time was, we believe, around 4 or 5 years old. He ends up as an adult moving to South Carolina, and that's where he joins the Anglican Church that I referred to before. He ends up dying relatively young, as you know, he's around in his probably 30s, maybe had hit 40. And the one time we see him resurface in the historical record, Hamilton finds out that Peter, who he's not been in touch with, has died and has disposed of most of his estate to other people, and he's left Hamilton just a pittance. And I think that this is deeply wounding to Alexander, because when Hamilton's mother dies and Hamilton is orphaned, his stepfather, Johann Levine, goes to the Danish courts to ensure that Peter alone inherits Rachel's estate and that Alexander gets nothing because Alexander's illegitimate. And so Alexander is not only orphaned, but he's also left financially destitute as a consequence of this. And I have to think that when his half-brother Peter ends up passing away and leaving Hamilton just a pittance of a larger estate that was originally his mother's, that it reopens all of those old wounds from this Caribbean past that was so painful he dared not speak of it even to his own family.
So as we're kind of moving into kind of his political realm, tell us about his stance on slavery, and do you feel like that had any kind of connect? Certainly he witnessed slavery very up close and personal in the Caribbean. How did that work into his kind of American ethos and his sense of identity?
Yeah, I think it's difficult for us to conceptualize what it was like to live in a slave society. That it was ubiquitous in ways that would be horrific to the modern eye, and were sort of unthinking to contemporaries. Hamilton grows up in the Caribbean, where slavery is far more barbaric than even the worst parts of the American South. The average slave only survives for 5 years in the Caribbean. It's such a brutal enterprise. Hamilton's import-export company that I mentioned he works for did traffic in slaves once a year. And Hamilton in New York is living in the northern city that has the largest slave population of any northern urban center. And we know for sure that he hires out slave labor. He rents slave labor from slave owners. He marries into a very prosperous slave owning family, the Schuyler family. There has been some claim made that Hamilton himself owned slaves. It's conceivable. If true, it wouldn't be shocking, but there's not hard evidence for it. It's also worth noting that Hamilton, even as he's complicit in the institution of slavery, as so many people were in various ways and to varying degrees, he's also the most pronounced abolitionist of any of the founders. He's one of the founding members of the New York Manumission Society. He is an active proponent of the idea that Blacks and whites are genetically equal. And that's radical in many people's views at that time. And so Hamilton, in so many respects, encapsulates a broader contradiction in America. It was not at all uncommon for abolitionists in the 18th century to also be slave owners. And the contradictions of the country, the cognitive dissonance between a nation conceived in the name of liberty and yet built on human bondage is one that we see registered in Hamilton's story and the lives of so many of his contemporaries. There's not necessarily a direct connection between Hamilton and the institution of slavery and his relationships with Jews, other than to say that Jews are also complicit in the institution of slavery in New York, no more than their Gentile counterparts, but also no less. And so Jews were equally likely to partake in the slave trade, equally likely to be slave owners, equally likely to not own slaves.
So this is a fascinating question to me, and I think it's one of those challenging ones because my guess is that there is very limited evidence that you can get from in her own words based on the historical record of the day. But this is a question about Rachel's virtue and reputation, and that in the musical she gets a bad rap. Here, we've talked about all of these, she leaves a husband who puts her in jail. She's tried for infidelity, all of these challenges. Can you give us any kind of insight into her aside from these things that certainly within her day would have been challenging, but clearly there's some sort of biopic that needs to be written about Rachel Levine. But
Yeah.
What can you tell us about her as a person? Anything more than those kinds of nuggets?
Sure. She seems like a fascinating figure. It's the case in the 18th century, and this is true of so much of history, that women's voices have been left out and erased. And so I don't think that means you give up, but I think it creates an extra burden on the historian to look for these marginalized voices and the echoes of them in other documents where other people might be writing about them. So for instance, with her, it would be court records, for instance. So Rachel is locked up for, quote, whoredom. So when she's referred to as a whore in the musical, that's actually language drawn directly from the historical record. As best we can tell, the Danes were using that word as a synonym for marital infidelity. There's not hard evidence that I've seen that she was engaged in what we'd call sex work now, that she was having an affair while married. She was living with this person she was having an affair with, and she ends up leaving the island and bearing Alexander out of wedlock, as mentioned. And so Rachel, to the best of our knowledge, is someone who flouts convention in her getting caught up in this sort of illicit tryst that gets her into all kinds of trouble. It prefigures Hamilton's complicity in the first major sex scandal in American political history, when he has an affair with Maria Reynolds. And so I think we can see a willingness in the mother, or some sort of echo from Hamilton of his mother there, but also perhaps in some of her better qualities. I mean, she had a difficult life in so many respects. Her parents end up getting separated, and her father dies. She ends up marrying someone who, by all accounts, was a terrible husband. And, she gets ill very young. She has to be resilient. And life could not have been easy for her. And in many respects, Hamilton had to be resilient himself. He wasn't handed anything either. We also know that she had a library with dozens of books. And this may have also anticipated Hamilton's own belletristic interests, his own love of books, his own early exposure to the written word, which became his principal tool for being able to uplift himself and promote change in American society. And so I think for good and for ill, it seems that Hamilton was his mother's son.
I love that. And I love that, just even in those small ways in which we can reclaim her personhood, I think is so important. And I so appreciate that opportunity. One of our participants here, Annette, is saying, I'd love to take a course from you. I'm sure that she is not alone in that. Luckily, I'm guessing you could actually find a way to audit Andrew's courses. Those things exist now. It's called the internet. It's great. And I don't know, for me, I've been singing this entire night. Every time you say something, I hear a tune from the musical. I'm sure that a lot of us are going to go listen to Hamilton, but thank you so much for sharing with us. This has been so, again and again in our comments, it was fascinating food for thought. So we really appreciate you coming out on this cold Milwaukee night. but no one had to even leave their house. How comfortable are we?
Sure. And if I could just say, in closing, the book is available on Amazon. So please go out and get yourself a copy. If you're interested in getting the whole story, I just had to give you guys some snippets tonight. And I want to thank you so much for having me. And if anyone wasn't able to get a question answered, you can reach out to me at Porwancher at ou.edu, as in Oklahoma University. You can also find my email address on the website, andrewporwancher.com. And feel free to reach out with questions. I'm happy to field any questions that, if I didn't get a chance to get to them tonight.
We'll throw that email into our follow-up email tomorrow, so people will have it. You guys, if you didn't get it down quickly enough. And someone on our chat is saying, hey, they're available at Boswell. So, if you want to, yes, the Amazon is an option. If you want to go support the local bookstore.
Yeah, support local bookstores. Definitely.
It's good for everybody. And in closing, I'm just going to say, well, first of all, yet again, thank you, Andrew. This was fabulous. And and we're just wrapping up Scrap. We're in the last couple of weeks. If you haven't seen Scrapyard yet, make sure you get to JMM before January 30th when we close. It is a phenomenal exhibit. And our last program for Scrapyard is on January 26th at 7 o'clock. It is our Built on Scrap Part 2. We have John Pollock coming back to talk about scrapping stereotypes. So if you have not heard John before, he's fabulous. And this is a session in which he's going to break down all of the different misperceptions within the scrap industry. Then on February 9th, we're starting to preview our exhibit about Japanese American internment with a Global Museum Passport virtual tour of the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. And that's February 9th at 12 o'clock. And we are really excited to be able to bring this exhibit to Milwaukee. And we're excited to give this preview of this fabulous National Museum on February 9th. Please, if you haven't had a chance to make a donation, do that now. You can book tickets to come visit JMM safely in person. And we love y'all. And thanks so much for coming out tonight.